Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. You will hear from industry leaders covering innovative, cutting-edge business, learning, and HR topics that weave current market research and technology into each episode. Our Excellence at Work podcast is hosted by Brandon Hall Group's Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, and thank you for tuning in today. Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm looking forward to our discussion today with Jerry Creel, the Chief Learning Officer from Clayton Homes. Jerry joined Clayton in August of 2000. His first 13 years at Clayton were spent as the VP of Human Resources and Training for the company's retail division. And before coming to Clayton, he was the VP of Human Resources for Oakwood Homes Corporation in Greensboro, North Carolina. The company was founded in 1956. Clayton is a diverse builder committed to quality and durability. Clayton offers traditional site-built homes and off-site built housing, including manufactured homes, tiny homes, college dormitories, military barracks, and apartments. All Clayton-built homes are proudly designed, engineered, and assembled in America. And in fact, in 2021, Clayton built more than 60,000 homes across the country. Clayton is also a Berkshire Hathaway company. Today we're going to be talking about two topics: reinvent leader development for the modern workforce and reimagining in-person learning post-pandemic. Hi, Jerry. It's so nice to have you here today. And we're going to be talking about some of the topics we saw as priorities from our HCM Outlook study around reinvent leader development for the modern workforce and reimagining in-person learning post-pandemic. And your team has done a lot of efforts around this to really kind of engage your employees and to help them through this process and post. So I'm really excited about hearing some of your points and examples that you are going to share. So let's start with reimagining in-person learning post-pandemic. What does that look like in your environment?
Well, thank you, Rachel. I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you. When it comes to post-pandemic learning, I think I'd kind of circle back to what was learning like, at least from our perspective in our organization prior to the pandemic. And it was, as maybe a lot of companies, but we weren't really heavy into virtual learning pre-pandemic. Probably for a couple reasons upon reflection. One is, we, from a cultural standpoint, we are very much a in-person relationship, feeling type of culture particularly when it comes to learning. So particularly in the leadership development space, a lot of our learning was by design based on our culture meant to be in person. So some of it was cultural based, but the other part of it was, we really didn't leverage a lot of what was out there from a virtual standpoint when it comes to learning technology. So I think those two reasons combined are why pre-pandemic we really were mostly in person. Now fast forward through the pandemic and what we've learned and where we are today. We were really fortunate. We only eliminated our in-person learning for a few months. As we all remember, COVID kind of hit us all by shock and awe around March of, 2020 now, something like that. And we canceled all of our in-learning classes the month of April, May, maybe even the first part of June. I'm going by memory here. But then after that, we were able to step back and adjust and following all of the guidelines and taking all the proper precautions, we did start back up some of our in-person learning. We just made the participants. We lowered the amount of participants and separated everybody, wore the masks and all of that. But we still did some in-learning through the in-person through the pandemic for reasons really that I stated earlier. It's from a leadership development standpoint, it's really part of our culture to have that in-person experience, because there's a lot of things that happen outside of the content. But it was a hybrid approach. As I look at where we are today, we learned so much through the pandemic on the virtual side that we really weren't aware of before, and some of the capabilities and some of what's possible that now, and I think a lot of companies can relate to this, we've been able to add some things to our learning to augment the in-person that's made us even more effective.
Let's go back a little bit, or kind of where we are right now, and looking at where we're headed in this modern workforce. How do you develop leaders to be successful? You've done a great job at Clayton, and I think the new leadership style right now, or developing leaders to be able to adapt and to be more proactive than reactive, and then at the same time still be able to adjust to what's happening. In our research, we saw that I think about 70% of organizations reported that they needed, different skills, or they needed to develop leaders and select leaders in a different way. So what, from your experience and what you're doing, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a lot of ways to answer that. I'm going to try to start off like very macro. Our journey started many years ago, and Kevin Clayton and Jim Clayton, they've always been committed to leadership, and we've always done leadership training in some form or fashion. I think as I look back, Rachel, where some of the things kind of went to another level and changed for us is back in 2011, 2012 time frame. As you know, most of the country and most organizations were coming off a pretty challenging few years, 2008, 2009, 2010. And I'll never forget our CEO, Kevin Clayton, sitting down in a discussion with me and making the comment that Jerry, we want to take our leadership development to another level. We really want world-class leadership development. So it's not to say that we weren't doing it before, but he really had a desire to take it to another level. And as I look back on that and kind of look at the journey that we've been on, there was some things that kind of had to happen in succession. There was an order of things that had to happen. And I would kind of summarize it by saying that we really set out in a very intentional way to identify and develop leaders in a very authentic way. And we wanted leaders to really be able to be the people who would inspire team member engagement. And so to kind of get onto that journey, we had to recognize that there were things that were necessary in order for that to happen. One of those things was to recognize that we had to define wellness in a different way. You may think, well, what does wellness have to do with anything? Well, for years we were defining wellness as physical, exercise and nutrition and all of that, and we realized that wellness was so much broader than that, as a lot of companies have realized that, and we basically reinvented the whole wheel. This was before we really started getting deep into leadership development. Before that, we started with redefining how we taught and what our culture would be like from a wellness perspective. And we added elements and disciplines into our wellness programs around emotional wellness and mental wellness and financial wellness. And we did that early on because from a leadership perspective, we really strongly believed and embraced the idea that leadership is emotional. It's not something you just go to a seminar and you learn different leadership principles, and it really is a very emotional thing. And so after we established that wellness culture, that's when we really started getting deeper into, okay, how can that shape how we do our leadership development? And that's why the in-person leadership development was so important, because we added a lot of emotional components, meditation, for example, yoga, because we strongly believe that a leader can't truly lead unless he genuinely cared for the people that he or she was leading. And so as I look back on our journey, that was kind of the order of things. And then once we had leadership, and I'm giving you like the macro view, once we had leadership development in place, and we started with our executive leadership, Kevin Clayton and his direct reports were the first ones to go through a customized 3-week experience. And we didn't do anyone in the company until that group went through it first. The entire 3 weeks, not a version of the 3 weeks, but the entire 3 weeks. And then from there, Rachel, we embarked on a 2.5-year journey where we took our top 125 leaders through this 3-week program that culminated in a week in Sedona, Arizona, where we really talked about well-being. We really talked about how does priority management affect your leadership, and how do you build a team, and where does meditation come into play? Where is that helpful? And since then we've implemented it through all other layers of the organization. But that's just a kind of a 300-foot view of our philosophy of leadership development and how we've gone about our journey.
And was that, you mentioned you started that before the pandemic, so that was already in play, and then during the pandemic you had to kind of pause with in-person development. Are you back to also offering in-person opportunities for that? Did you do anything virtually to deliver any aspects of it during the pandemic?
So as I mentioned earlier, we only went about 2 or 3 months where we suspended all in-person learning.
Okay.
That's it. And then we got back into, particularly with our, you'll see the sign behind me that says Ignite. That's how we brand all of our leadership development. So the experience that I mentioned that we started with Kevin Clayton, his direct reports, was our executive level leadership development program that was a 3-week program. Since then, we've launched mid-level management, Ignite leadership development, as well as entry-level management. And those are the ones that we actually paused in person for about 3 months because we had a full calendar already in place. And after that 3 months was over, we went back to the in-person for all of those experiences.
And did you get any pushback being able to go back to kind of where you were so quickly? Post-pandemic, during
That's
pandemic?
a great question. We anticipated a little pushback. I think the first way I would answer that is a lot of folks, because of the culture that Kevin has created, the Ignite programs are something that a lot of people really want to go through, and you have to be selected to go through it. So there's a lot of excitement and pent-up demand, and when someone gets selected to go through it, they really enjoy it. So for the most part, Rachel, they really wanted these things to get started back up. But obviously, this was uncharted territories. So we were really sensitive to that, and we made it very clear and communicated very thoroughly and had the relationships to do this, where if anyone was uncomfortable at all with in-person learning, we accommodated that. We changed where maybe they would be more comfortable going through a session that started a year later. That I can count on my one hand and have fingers left over how many people opted to do that because they were concerned. But we were very sensitive to that and accommodated that.
Okay. And now looking where we are now in the, going through this initiative of yours and developing people and leaders, and that's one of the attributes too that we saw in our research is the emotional intelligence, the team development. There's about 10 key areas that that companies are focusing on now as it relates to developing leaders and what they need to do. Also about inclusion and a number of other attributes as well. What would you say? How would you define what makes a great leader today?
Wow. Well, that is a loaded question. I think first and foremost, I would say someone who is humble. You know, if I had to point to one thing that is most important in our culture and one thing that we really stress in our formal leadership development programs is the importance of humility. And of course, everybody defines humility in different ways. That's a really tricky word. And it can also be a real emotionally charged word. Nobody wants anyone to suggest that they're not humble, right? And everyone would say
Balance,
that
right?
they are humble.
Confidence versus being human.
Yes, exactly. So that would be in our culture anyway. We go through great strengths. We have every single leader in our organization read the book The Ideal Team Player by Lencioni, where it talks about being humble and being smart. Wonderful author. We use several of his books throughout our various leadership development programs. But I would say a leader being humble, and to be humble, you have to be self-aware, and to be humble, you also have to be vulnerable. To be a great leader, you have to be able to create trust amongst your team. Well, you can't create trust amongst your team unless you're vulnerable and unless you have a level of humility. So there's a lot of things that go into these ingredients of what makes a great leader. But if I had to lay out one thing that we've emphasized in our culture and in our leadership development and in our practices of promoting and coaching leaders, it's humility.
Yeah, we see a lot of good examples of creating these sandboxes or these exercises where they can kind of run through. Not that we don't want it to be authentic, but I do think that it takes time and it's a skill to be able to articulate your vulnerability in a way where you can also still be seen as a leader. You have to still come across confident, and you have to be able to influence and kind of move everyone together in a common direction of what you want to have to be able to accomplish. So I think being able to be transparent about things that maybe you are you find that you're not an expert, because I think that at some point in the past, leaders did not want to admit if they are not an expert. And that's just not possible. You can't be an expert in everything, but you have to be able to have a good understanding of kind of the baseline of everything, or at least, for the most part, right, what you're trying, the strategy, and then, being vulnerable and being able to share some examples, I think makes the people that are around you more comfortable and more real and more trusted. So, but that's what I think a lot of these programs or initiatives like yours is creating the scenarios and those examples where you can test it out amongst your peers or in different situations, just to kind of see the reactions and to be able to kind of also, make sure that, that it's a balance, right, of humility and accountability.
Yeah, those are some great points, Rachel. And you mentioned, I don't think you used the word kind of the old school thinking of leadership, where you got to be tough and you got to have all the answers, and you got to be on, and this, it's a tricky balance, isn't it? Kind of, well, if that's not ideal in this new world, so to speak, of leadership. What is that balance? And it's just so tricky, and we've learned that, and we're very conscious of that in all of our leadership development programs, is just acknowledging that this is kind of how we've always thought about leadership. And it's interesting how the pandemic has played into this as well. So as we go into the pandemic, Now, by this time, I think our executive leadership had done an amazing job. And I think that's very, very important too, Rachel, is when I say our executive leadership, I've been in a couple other companies before I came to Clayton. And what I experienced in those companies, and I'm not saying this was right or wrong, I'm just saying what I've seen in some other companies is the HR department or the OD department, they're kind of the ones that are tasked with all this, coming up with all this, embracing all this, and kind of overseeing all of this. What I have seen at Clayton, and I think it's a little different than, well, I know it's different where I've been. I think it's also a little different than most places. I network with a lot of senior HR professionals, is our operational executive team is who leads this.
Right.
Of course, they count on me to and my team to kind of come up with some of the things to deploy. But as far as the people who are out front embracing and supporting, it's our operational leadership. And when COVID hit, we had already established that culture with our operational leaders and our business leaders. And so when you tie in wellness to all this, here you're talking about a time when people were scared, Rachel. People were scared. There were so many things that people were going through, and team members are people, employees are people. And they were going through a lot of things, just trying to get their head wrapped around this whole thing called COVID and quarantining and isolation. And there was all of the manifestations of all of that. And so we were able to create a program through our wellness program tied into our leadership programs called Let's Talk. And basically, in a nutshell, it was something that our leaders rolled out where, look, you don't have to have all the answers, leader. You don't have to fix problems, but we need to take the lead on making sure that everybody understands that it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to have fears. It's okay to have concerns. It's okay to feel isolated. It's okay to have anxiety about all of this unknown environment that we're navigating. It's okay, but it's not okay to keep it all in. We have to talk about it. So there was just some interesting things that we were able to navigate, that we learned that the foundation that was created from our leadership development and focusing on vulnerability and trust and authenticity really helped us navigate COVID in an I would say effective way.
Right. And that's, that was the opportunity that most, or those that saw it as an opportunity from the pandemic, is that we were all put into the situation with no control, with no options. We're all shut down. Our experiences or our environments are a little bit different depending on your home life, right? So, we all had to think, how do we manage this, and how do we, even have some humor with it. And at one point, I was yelling at my husband, "Don't touch the groceries and leave them outside the door." And I'm looking back now, and I'm like, that's kind of crazy.
Crazy. I mean, it's just we didn't know.
Maybe that's not a good word to use. I'm sorry. It's a little overreactive, but we all kind of had moments of what we felt was a little bit of insanity that we had to figure out how do we manage the best that we can. Right. And so, if anything, at least for me is to create some humor from that experience, and then also use it as an opportunity of what we can do better, and and how we can what we need to do better at work, what we need to do better, personally. So again, it's I feel like it left us with a lot of opportunities because we had no choice as far as being in that situation. But we saw in companies that, for yours as an example, they didn't really pause that much, especially companies that had a lot of technology in place that had somewhat of a hybrid model. They this was a push for them to even go further, where they may not have gone as advanced with their, with some of their new, virtual, AR, metaverse, new ways of, blending their learnings. They're just kind of push them further above the curve that they would have normally maybe taken them another 5 years to get to where they are today. So again, that's an opportunity that a lot of companies used, and even for some companies that didn't have a lot of technology in place, they had to think about what they needed and kind of move ahead. And now we're in this new modern world. And so before we wrap up today, Jerry, what advice would you give leaders as far as setting yourself up for success as we kind of go into the next, where are we? The next 10 years here, 5 years?
Yeah, well, we are still learning every single day, Rachel. We really are. As I look over the next 10 years, we're super fortunate because we have, as you know, we're part of the Berkshire Hathaway family of companies.
Sure.
So we get to partner with some amazing companies and learn from them and just share ideas. But over the next decade, I think a couple things that I think are opportunities for us. First, and these are in no particular order, finding that balance that you're asking about, that balance between in-person learning and in-person experiences versus virtual, and where is one appropriate or the other one may not be as appropriate, and how do you blend all that together, and how do you take in-learning person experiences, and one of the greatest things we've learned is through this, and I love how you said that, the pandemic has kind of expedited learning as far as companies, and one of the things that helped us is the pandemic has taught us how we can use virtual learning in a whole different way to augment in-person learning, and also use virtual learning to create follow-up and keep the learning alive from an in-person learning event. So there's just so many things that we've learned. So I think that's going to be the challenge and opportunity for all of us over the next 10 years is how do we continue to take what we've learned and apply that to all of our learning and development and succession planning and performance management, because all those things tie together. How do we take what we learn and apply that and strike the right balance in all of that from an effectiveness standpoint? The second thing I would say is how do you I guess the best way I can say this, Rachel, is prior to pandemic, whatever your practices were, whether it was everybody's in the workplace and there's no virtual stuff, work from home stuff, all that, to now you go through the pandemic and some companies and organizations went like the opposite direction. Like, okay, now everybody is virtual and working from home. And so I think a challenge that is ahead for Clayton, and I'm going to assume a lot of other companies, is post-pandemic, as things, God willing, normalizes, continues to normalize. What is that balance from that perspective? Because people do need connection, and leadership's all about connection. And there has to be some type of balance between virtual and in-person, just because that's what the human spirit needs. Not maybe everybody, but most people need that connection. And I think that's going to be something that we're all going to grapple with over the next several years, is where is that balance between virtual and in learning. Does that make sense?
Oh, of course. We're watching that carefully, and we're looking at the patterns and trends, what companies are doing now. And, we're hearing a lot of mix of, we've gotten rid of all of our offices. We're entirely virtual. And there, some of these companies are a couple thousand employees that are doing this. They're not just small firms. And some companies, depending on the industry, are forced to kind of rethink and move into more of a hybrid environment, and thinking about, certain jobs can certainly be, virtual, and certain jobs have to be if you have a storefront, or if you have, certain, specific roles that are client facing. And even that, some of that's being automated. Banking is, a lot of banking is being automated. So we'll see, what that's going to look like moving forward. But I do think, and from a research perspective, that it's about the balance and kind of, and also hopefully, nothing outside of our circumstances pushes us back into another forced, shutdown or isolating us again, because then we have to then adapt to that. But if we continue to move forward, then we have to figure out what is that balance of in-person versus virtual. And I don't think we'll ever be entirely in person again. I think the workplace will kind of adjust to kind of what that mix, and also having a balance too for those that are more or less like to be in person versus those that are inclined to be more remote, and then but kind of bridging that together.
Yeah. Well, the research that you all are doing, not that you've asked for a plug, but it's great work that you all are doing, and we appreciate it. Our company is so happy with the relationship that we have with you. Our learning professionals leverage all of the wonderful things that your organization provides. So it's great work that you're doing, and we appreciate it.
Well, great, and we appreciate you and sharing your perspective and being a pioneer in this time of uncertainty. But I think the uncertainty is moving forward to more certainty of figuring out what's best for our next phase. And on that, that's a wrap. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for sharing your experience and expertise.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I enjoyed the opportunity.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Take care.